Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pierce, as Ukraine War News Update for the 24th of November 2024, the second part thereof. We're going to start in this military aid section or video. By the way, we're also going to talk a little bit of stockpiles later, with the US, according to Reuters, being very close to making a decision on long-range missiles for Ukraine, although delivery could take several months. These are most likely these are the JASSM cruise missiles, air-launched cruise missiles. Although I doubt they'll be the longest range ones, Ukraine desperately needs cruise missiles because they're really depending on the UK Storm Shadow stockpiles and the Scalp EGs from France and Italy, although Italy have not allowed Ukraine to fire those missiles deep into Russian territory. So they have only really relatively very few of those missiles to go through. They've been chomping through them. They would absolutely welcome JASSM cruise missiles, although, you know, with the way that you're seeing some of these, I was going to say analysts, podcasters like Joe Rogan and others, the way you've seen their opinions be splurged onto the internet concerning missile use by the Ukrainians, you'd think that there'll be quite a big kickback within the US. There just needs to be some corrective given. And in fact, I was seeing Jake Bro, and he was the person I was thinking of initially. I was looking at Joe Rogan's excerpt, and if you haven't seen it, go and check my earlier video today. But he was unfortunately giving pro-Russian narrative with regard to escalation, missile use, etc., just deeply ignorant. Unfortunately, he needs a corrective, and I think Jake Bro would be fantastic. And Jake Bro has put himself forward on Twitter saying, look, how can I get onto Joe Rogan to give him the correct information that he needs, because this is not helping when you have people with huge influence saying things that are essentially Russian propaganda. When we're at a time with the new administration just about to come in the US, where the old administration needs to be giving as much as possible to Ukraine, and that should be met with congratulations by Americans and Ukrainians alike. But to have that negative kickback is really counterproductive. Anyway, JASSM cruise missiles would be super useful for the Ukrainians. I really do hope they get those soon. There's been talk about these previously. I thought they'd been given the go-ahead previously, but obviously they are still wondering about these. Now, the French, this happened a couple of days ago. Here, the Kyiv Independent talks about an excerpt from a BBC interview with the French Foreign Minister, Jean-Noël Barrot. This is something the French had previously said anyway. I've reported on this, but let's just reiterate that the French have not, and he says that the Western allies should not set and express red lines. Absolutely agree with this. Those red lines have been red lines that have been put in place by Western allies, not by Russia themselves, not by Ukraine. It's been Western allies saying, oh, no, we can't give these, because if we give these, then Russia will escalate. And then Russia goes, oh, I'll take that red line and I'll apply it. Thank you very much. You said it will be escalatory. If you give F-16s to Ukraine, yep, it will be. We'll just concur with that. We are the ones setting our own red lines. And it's great to see the French here saying we shouldn't set red lines for ourselves, and we shouldn't give restrictions to the use of weapons into, for example, into Russia. And so the French are fine with the Ukrainians using Scalp EGs into Russia, those air-launched cruise missiles. Okay, Viggo Holmsen here, just a comment I thought was worth talking about, and go back to the Joe Rogan Joe Rogan, monologue. Most of these podcasters like Joe Rogan are spinning off the perception that a big portion of their taxes are used to prop up Ukraine instead of being used domestically, while in reality it has virtually no impact, and most is used to stimulate the US economy. This is a point I've been making time and time again for years, but it's absolutely right, Viggo. We need to keep repeating these same points. Russia is not being named as the culprit and left out of the discussion entirely because, again, in their perception, their actions do not directly impact the American taxpayer. And this is a really good point. It's so frustrating that, for example, with Joe Rogan, but many others, they talk about, hey, the war is as a result of NATO expansionism, or is the US's fault, or the US is at fault for escalating the war by providing X, Y, and Z. And they never once mentioned the 14,000 plus missiles that Russia has sent into Ukraine to kill civilians and destroy the energy infrastructure. They never once mentioned the war crimes by the Russians. They never once mentioned Putin being morally culpable for this war. They don't do it. It's absent from their conversation. As Vigo continues, a myopic and distorted view, to be sure, and one that does not take into account more than surface perceptions without looking to any causality, despicable and totally misleading. Anyone with a shred of intelligence could pick this type of reasoning apart in a millisecond, absolutely, but people don't desire to do so. There are plenty of people with the requisite intelligence that don't do so because they don't have the desire to do so because it fits into their narrative that this is all the deep state, the American deep state, and we're anti-deep state, we're anti-establishment. And so Trump's going to come in, he's just going to stop all this stuff because he's for us, he's for the people, he's for the taxpayer. Oh, what? He's giving his mates a tax break? Yeah, but he's for the taxpayer. Oh, as long as the taxpayers are billionaires. Oh, I get it. Right, okay. It's this like warped idea of who Trump is and what he'll do when he gets in, when actually he's just interested in self-aggrandizement. We really need to be explaining very clearly what the advantages of supporting Ukraine are, why this is geopolitically essential that Ukraine prevails. No one's done a good job over the last 2.5 years of going on national television and explaining everything, just all in one big video, like one I would do, just to explain to the American electorate exactly why the US is getting involved with Ukraine. There's no such thing as a free lunch. This is in the US's best interest, and here's for why. Okay. Going to Germany, German aid to Ukraine just reminds us that so far 88 Leopard 1A5s, and we've seen some of these on the lost list from Andrew Perpetua, but 88 Leopard 1A5s have been delivered to Ukraine so far, and there are at least 47 more pledged to be delivered in the future. So that's good news. They should be getting some more of those tanks. Although they're fairly old tanks, Leopard 1s, they are, I presume, refurbished up to a standard where they have fire control systems and optics that are better than the equivalent Russian tanks. Now, let's go on to talk of what's going on with Russian equipment and recruitment. So Russia is running out of men. This is an idea we've seen lots of. In fact, it was PS01 talking about how a Russian supermarket appears to be now employing African people, African men, to do jobs. So there is a real labour shortage precisely because of the war. Russia's running out of men. Military commissars of the Pskov region have started hunting for homeless people and alcoholics to become a contract soldier of the Russian armed forces. It is enough to simply wash well at the military commissariat. It is not clear why this is done. Perhaps mobilisation plans are not being fulfilled, or perhaps someone is taking a one-time payment under the contract for each body handed over to military commissariat. The simple fact of the matter is they've got quotas and they are in need of bums on seats. They are needed boots on the ground. It doesn't matter who they are, to the point where you're getting North Koreans, you're also getting Yemenis, and I reported this earlier today. Russia recruits Yemeni mercenaries for war in Ukraine, says Financial Times. Russia's operation to recruit hundreds of Yemenis for the war in Ukraine has highlighted the growing ties between Moscow and Houthis. Yemeni mercenaries are reported to have suffered huge losses. Flash News says Russia has recruited hundreds of Yemenis to fight that war in Ukraine, according to the FT. Now, they are lured to Russia by deception and forced to sign contracts they cannot even read. Scheme is classic. Foreigners are promised high-paying jobs and Russian citizenship, but are instead recruited into the army and sent to the front. That is one interpretation of that. I mean, simply put, the more of these people, as in foreigners, anyone who is ill suited for the job, such as I reported one earlier, someone who was an older man who was unable to walk without a walking stick, sent to the front line. Okay, those kind of people, alcoholics and homeless people, are rumoured here. Now, some of this might be over-exaggeration or psyops, but there seems to be an awful lot of these anecdotes that lead one to believe that the Russians are desperate for personnel. They are succeeding on the front line, but they're doing so by just throwing people at the problem, and it's working for them. But how long can they keep doing this, and will there be any pushback from within Russia? Well, the advantage of getting North Koreans and Yemenis and people from all over the shop, is that they don't get any pushback for that. Okay, the Indian government under Modi pulled back Indians who had been lured into the same situation. But generally speaking, you get these people dying, you're not paying money for their deaths. As we heard this morning, 8% of the national budget is being poured into paying for dead soldiers, compensation to families, etc., etc. With these people brought in from abroad, these Yemeni mercenaries, they're going to be paying jack when these people die. So there's a real benefit for Russia for using these. Yes, there'll be language issues. Yes, training or this or that or whatever. And particularly care. It's like, here's a gun, here's a vehicle. Get in that vehicle. We're going to send you over there. Shoot some Ukrainians. And we'll come to this a little bit later because there's a bit of a discussion point with someone. I think that is not a problem for Russia. I think Russia will happily use those people. It's a problem for Ukraine, and it's a bigger problem than some people, I think, anticipate. Now, War Translated here says, Russian bloggers note that the alleged absence of damage to the Yuzhmash plant in Dnipro, which was attacked by the mega missile Oreshnik, something the so-called president of Russia has been boasting about for days, is being presented. So Russian mill bloggers are kind of realizing that it's not all that. Here we have a piece or a comment saying, satellite images of Yuzhmash, which was struck by the Oreshnik missile, have surfaced. The workshops are intact. Nothing has been reduced, quote, reduced to dust. However, it seems a private residential area above took some damage. In other words, Russians are realizing that the claims from Putin and others that this missile has reduced XY to dust are just not true. Actually, no report says Russia is launching North Korean KN. Or actually, there was another one. Yes, this is what I meant to say first. I just went past it. Russia's Oreshnik missile likely had no explosives and didn't cause much damage, according to the Bild, the German tabloid newspaper. Russia's Oreshnik missile that targeted Dnipro likely carried no explosive charge and did not cause significant damage, German media outlet Bild reported, citing Julian Röpke. The Oreshnik nuclear-capable intermediate-range ballistic missile was likely a modification of Russia's RS-26 Rubezh missile, he said. So it is a bit underwhelming, but for a lot of people in the West who are willing to be scared by this saber rattling, this is enough to go, oh, World War III has started, terrible, we need to stop giving Ukraine X, Y, and Z. Well, actually, you've got Russians now saying that missile wasn't all it was ramped up to be. Now, Russia is also launching North Korean KN-23 missiles at Ukraine, so it's fine for Russia to launch North Korean missiles and Iranian missiles, but as soon as Ukraine uses some Western-provided missiles, everyone goes nuts. But anyway, they've been launching these North Korean KN-23 missiles with Western components, making them, according to CNN. As I mentioned earlier today, Ukrainian officials confirmed that while the metal is from North Korea, the electronics and missile control systems are foreign made. But again, those naysayers are silent on that, aren't they? Right, Russia, quote, Russia produces as many weapons and ammunition in 3 months as the entire European Union does in a year, according to Boris Pistorius, the defense minister for Germany. Now, we have an issue because if the Trump administration comes in and refuses to support Ukraine in similar ways that the Americans have, then there's going to be trouble. And Europe are going to have to step up. But if Europe step up, then there's a massive capacity gap between the production of the whole of Europe and Russia. Although that potentially we could close that gap, but 2.5 years in, that still is woefully far away. Now, I was speaking to Pierre in a pub last night where I was saying, look, I am really worried because those consistent arms packages that came from the US that were not particularly exciting. You know, the ones pretty much like the last one, $275 million arms package that came out this last week, right? It was HIMARS ammunition, 105 and 155 mil artillery shells. It were tow missiles, javelins, all these kind of like the bog standard stuff that Ukraine needs to operate on a weekly, monthly basis. If the US stops providing them, there is no one to step in to give that volume of stuff to Ukraine. Ukraine are going to go through that period like we saw, the 7 months of the hiatus of the US providing stuff for Ukraine. We're going to see that again. There will be desperate shortages. The US is vitally important for Ukraine. The EU and UK and Japan and others will have to massively step up. Now, you could see South Korea start to be important here. It's interesting that the former Taiwanese president, has just come out and said, the US needs to be supporting Ukraine before they support us. So those who want the US to pivot away from Ukraine to help Taiwan, and you get a number of those in the MAGA group, the anti-China contingent of the MAGA group, you've got Taiwan saying, no, you need to help Ukraine first. China is looking at Ukraine to learn what to do with Taiwan. And if you don't successfully support Ukraine, we are done for. Support Ukraine first. That's a really important message. Now, you might get sort of South Korea coming on board. You might get Japan starting to come on board a bit more formally. But there is this massive gap between what the EU, what Europe can do, and what Russia can do at the moment. And that's serious. As, Euromaidan Press says, Russia's weapons production outpaces the EU by a factor of 4. Putin's global ambitions need us to be wary enough to get our readiness much increased. We need to be much more ready, and we need to support Ukraine to a far greater level in terms of industrial outputs. Now, as I've said, we are ramping up, but there's a huge gap still there. Right, we're going to go to Covert Cabal, who has looked at a pretty major tank storage base that's now virtually empty, the 22nd tank storage base. Let's listen to tanks first and then IFVs.
2022, 2023, and now 2024. And here are those numbers. Just a huge drop from 764 to just 102, which is about only 13% remaining. At the rail station just to the east, you can see about a dozen tanks being loaded onto rail cars to be shipped out. So it continues to decline. For the longest time, this section in the southern part of...
So a bunch of tanks have gone, and they've only got relatively few tanks left. I mean, it's just a huge decrease in numbers of tanks. And of course, what's left will be the very, very worst tanks.
Previous BMPs and closer to tank size. And speaking of BMPs and other armored fighting vehicles, here are those numbers. Unlike other central tank storage bases, which consist mainly of just tanks and BMPs, this one has a lot of other types as well. But those total numbers from 1,350 pre-war to just 601 now means less than 45% remain. But a huge caveat here though is roughly half of those vehicles are in these sections here. And we are lucky enough to have some real up-close images of the vehicles that are here. And just look at them. Normally we might write these off, and Russia would too. But some of them have moved around a bit, a few others have been removed over the last 4 years, so we added them, but in our worst category. So a more practical number of armored fighting vehicles is down to probably around 300 or less instead of 600. And really the only decent vehicles are the 202 BMPs here. It'll be interesting to see what Russia does with this base, being that...
And those 202 BMPs will not be in a good... Like, all the best ones will have already been taken, right? You always are going to take your best ones first. So we have what is almost certainly an indication of what's going on in the deep stockpiles in Russia, across Russia, is that they are getting lower and lower in terms of what they can use to throw at the war in Ukraine, which is why we're seeing cars and trucks being used to deliver troops to the front lines, and why we're seeing tanks get turned into tracked garden sheds to work as APCs and not as tanks, because APCs are more useful than tanks. That's the reality of what is happening, and I think it's fairly desperate for the Russians. I really do. And I think the whole war is desperate for the Russians, which is why we are seeing North Koreans brought in. But North Koreans, I think, are a game changer because they are just human beings that can be thrown at Ukraine to take more and more land. What would be my general position of the war at the moment is, if Ukraine had the forces, the boots on the ground now, if they counterattack now, I reckon Russia would crumble in many places. Russia are doing quite well in terms of just taking territory. The whole of the south area around Velika Novosilka. But I think they're doing that with just the most desperate assembly of humans and vehicles. And they're doing that because the Ukrainians are desperately low on numbers and stretched right across the front lines and waiting for I think they're waiting for reserves to be equipped and trained. But if you suddenly came across like 15,000 troops and threw them in as a counterattack in the south, I reckon the Russians would not be up to defend that. And I think you've got two exhausted sets of troops and resources smashing against each other, and that is allowing Russia to take lots of land. But I don't think they're particularly militarily justified in doing so. Well, they are. It's like one exhausted force against another exhausted force, and you're just taking that land by numbers, by overcoming. These are Pyrrhic victories that would be Pyrrhic if there could be a counterattack that would lead to a much greater capitulation. So, if Ukraine suddenly came across 50,000, 60,000, 100,000 troops, you would just be able to, I think, overcome the Russian lines massively and take back way more than the Russians gained. So the Russians have massively exhausted themselves, but it only becomes a Pyrrhic victory, i.e. a victory that ends up to a greater defeat, if the Ukrainians had the numbers to then re-attack them. But the question is, do they have them? And the answer is no. And so they need to do the way, at the moment, the most likely way for Ukraine to succeed is an economic collapse of Russia, is my opinion at the moment. They just need a lot more boots on the ground. And it would be great if the Europeans could come in and start, or NATO could come into the west of Ukraine and free up a bunch to then go and fight on the front lines. But anyway, so that my approach that the North Koreans are a game changer and allowing the Russians to prolong the war. Someone here calls out, as David Himmelsbach says, totally wrong call. One, North Korean troops are repressed and horny as hell. Paradrop, smartphones, VR goggles, vodka and porn. Problem solved. So they are becoming addicted to porn, apparently, as an anecdote. Seeing the unrestrained internet in a way that they never had before. Such boys will never go back to Pyongyang, I agree, but that's not a concern. Like right now, they are able to be used as meat assaults on the Ukrainians. Videos of wrist addiction have already gone viral on the internet. True, but I don't think it fundamentally changes my calculus. Putin is finally bankrupt and insolvent. It's down to issuing script. That's what happens to any fiat currency when you can't use it outside your own nation. Indian rupees have the same character. Putin has rupees coming out of his ears. India never produces a single thing useful for Putin. Modi won't send him US dollars. Heh, is barter next? Well, we have seen some barter between the two countries. But this is my point, is that I think there's going to be an economic capitulation. But militarily, these North Korean soldiers can prolong the war and aid Russia's gain of territory. 3, it's highly questionable whether Putin can stay on his throne for another 60 days. It's that bad. I tend to agree. I reckon the next 60 days is going to be vital. That's why I keep talking about the economy every day. I don't disagree. Worse, Peskov, so the Dmitry Peskov, the spokesman for the Kremlin, is now telling the world that Putin does not even need conscription. The last time Peskov uttered such blather, Putin inducted hundreds of thousands a week later. 6, Putin's airliners are now largely grounded. His Hilo fleet is next. It uses Ukrainian turbines. Didn't you know? 7, right around the corner, Putin's AF is going to be grounded Air Force. It's falling out of the sky all on its own, as are the glide bombs. I think this is a very positive look at it, but there are aspects of this which I think are true. And I think the next 2 months are going to be absolutely vital. It could be the case that Russia could capitulate, but they're trying to get as many square kilometers as they can before they do so. The question is, what can Ukraine do back, and will the US pull out of support at that key vital time? This is crucial. This is do or die moment, I really think, in terms of the war. Let me know what you think. Thank you for that comment. I don't think it does disprove my point, but because I actually agree that actually undergirding this potential use of North Korean troops is the desperation that is leading to that use. and an economic collapse, and perhaps issues with mechanized equipment, potentially with the Air Force, so on and so forth. Really, my point depends on whether 11,000 North Korean troops, it could become 100,000 or not. If it doesn't become 100,000, not too much of a problem. If Russia is able to keep drawing on North Korea more and more and more, that's a serious problem. So really, my whole thesis that the North Korean troops are a game changer is dependent on, they're only a game changer if they can continue doing so. 11,000 is not enough to change the course of the war. It's a real headache for the Ukrainians because they have to then trick their way through 11,000 extra troops now. But if it stays there, okay, doesn't really change things much. But we've seen supposedly, 50 self-propelled guns and 20 multiple launch rocket systems. If you start saying, right, 100,000 troops and several hundred SPGs and multiple launch rocket systems, then I think we have a bit of an issue for the Ukrainians. Let me know what you think. Thank you so much for your comments. I always appreciate really well thought out comments. Take care, everybody, and I'll speak to you soon.